So, I think I know most of you actually, but just in case, my name is Alana Sinclair and I am the manager at Cambridge Carbon Footprint. I'm here this evening to talk primarily about fundraising for small groups. And so I wanted to kick off actually with a couple of statistics. So the vast majority of people donate because they're asked. And I think that is probably, pretty understandable. I think that's probably something that rings true for most of us. But I think it's interesting that actually donating can make people more engaged. So according to the Chartered Institute of Fundraising, over 60% of people, once they had donated, took additional positive steps to becoming more engaged with the group. So doing things like volunteering, coming to events, and interacting more on social media. So fundraising is great, obviously, because it brings in money to support what you're doing, but actually it can also help people become more engaged in what you're doing too. So as a small group, where would you start to look when you're thinking about fundraising? I think there are really three key questions, and we'll cover each of them during this presentation. So firstly, looking at how you can responsibly manage any money that you might manage to raise. Secondly, we'll cover some ideas about who you might actually ask for money, including some local grants, with the caveat that I'm afraid most of them are South Cambs focused, although not all. And then finally, how you can put together a good funding ask. So kicking off, I'm afraid, with maybe some of the more boring questions that we're going to cover this evening, looking at how you might actually manage your money as a small group. In many ways, this is actually really dependent on the structure of your group. And so, I mean, there are various ways to look at this, but I think broadly speaking, there are three categories of groups. So firstly, small groups, and that's primarily what I'll be focusing on tonight. Small groups are typically run by, a few individuals working together without any formal structure. So if you are just getting started in this, this is probably where you're at. And it's a great place to be for doing any kind of community events, simple projects. The only downside really is that as a small group without much structure, you're unlikely really to be able to set up a bank account or be able to apply for funding on your own. There are some exceptions to this, which I will cover on the next slide, but mostly as a small group, your fundraising would be really quite limited to, maybe what you can raise at events or similar. And so you might hold on to cash, or you might put it in someone's bank account, but obviously that's, not terribly secure. So if you do reach a stage where you are wanting to start fundraising in earnest, you would at that stage want to look at becoming a constituted group. So that doesn't have to be too onerous. It does require that you adopt a constitution, but in essence, that's really just a kind of agreed set of rules for how your group will operate. And there are a whole bunch of templates out there on the internet. I think I've got some linked in the resource section at the end of my presentation. And the benefit that you get at that stage is that you can apply for a bank account in your group's name, start applying for funding, and those sorts of things. You can even apply for a charitable status at that point. One thing that I will just point out, I think for the most part, this is as far as any of you would want to go. There is just one kind of caveat that I think people should be aware of as either a small group or a constituted group, which is that those are both unincorporated structures, which is totally fine. It just means that as individuals who are responsible for the group, you do bear some liability for the debts of the group. So if it comes to starting to raise more serious funds or take on more risks as a group, that is when you might want to look at maybe becoming an incorporated group. Obviously, there's a lot more kind of setup involved, and you need to start doing reporting, submitting accounts to, the Charities Commission and that sort of thing. So you want to, you don't want to do that unless it's absolutely strictly necessary. But I did just want to point out that when you do become incorporated, you do then get a separate legal entity, which means that, if there are more risks, those risks are taken on by that separate legal entity, not by the individuals who are involved. But as a constituted group or an incorporated group, you can be a charity. Charity is a status, not necessarily a legal structure. For the most part, you don't need to worry about any of this. Starting as a small group, no formal constitution, you can get quite far. And as I mentioned earlier, you can even start to raise funds. There are alternatives to kind of getting a constitution and getting a bank account. In terms of really low barrier to entry, you could just start making friends with some local companies who might donate their services to you instead of you having to pay for them. Or you might enter into a sponsorship arrangement, and you could ask them in lieu of giving you money to actually just pay some invoices directly for you. Another option might be to actually look at partnering with another organization who might manage the funds on your behalf. So you might be able to talk to your local parish council if you have a good relationship with them, a local church, another charity, and they might be able to work with you on projects and apply for grants on your behalf. And finally, and this is a newer one to me, but there are actually a whole host of fiscal hosting services out there. So I've linked one that is run by an organization that I know to actually be quite reputable. And so essentially they act as a host. You can even apply for grants. They just there's a setup fee, and then they would take a percentage of the funds that they manage for you. But it's a way of sort of providing transparency in what you're doing and demonstrating to any funders that you are managing your funds responsibly. So if you are in a position to start fundraising, you know how you're going to manage your funds. The next thing to start thinking is, who are we going to actually ask for money? These are just some ideas to get you started, really. I'm sure you would have your own ideas. But the logical place to start is really thinking about your community. I won't go into these in too much depth. We can have a chat about these in the breakout room later. These are some types of events that I've been involved in at CCF that we have run as fundraisers, or groups that we know have run as fundraisers. But I would always say, whatever activity you are running, remember to ask. Put someone by the door or at some point near to where people are entering and exiting, and make sure you ask them as they're coming or going. And apologies to Paul here, I've put your photo in my presentation. But you can see Paul there shaking the tub for the Water Beach Repair Cafe.
Oh, that's fine. I've forgotten that photo had been taken.
It's a nice one, I think. Yeah, and a few more different things, supermarket schemes, crowdfunding, the Big Give Green Match Fund, increasing, I think, in sort of ambition there. Yeah, happy to talk more about those in the breakout rooms as well. In terms of local grants, one that I particularly want to draw your attention to is this PECT 30 for 30. So I mentioned earlier that as kind of groups without constitutions, it's generally speaking hard to apply for grants. This is an exception. So this PECT 30 for 30, you can actually apply as an individual. So if you do have any projects in mind, the only thing I would say is it needs to be probably somewhere between Cambridge and Peterborough. So if you're on that side of Cambridge and you have an idea in mind, I would have a look at this one, because you don't need to be a constituted group in order to apply. There are also a couple of grants, obviously, from South Cambs that I won't talk about because I'm sure Orla will cover them later. And then I would also recommend that you check out the Cambridgeshire Community Foundation. In particular, their Fund for Nature might be relevant if that's a theme that your group is thinking about, but they have a variety of other grants that it's worth taking a look at. And if you want to look further afield, I would register for a grant database that offers email updates. Support Cambridgeshire is one which is organised locally, so it will capture the local stuff as well as a lot of the national stuff. And I would say if you are interested in doing anything about your, local community buildings, there do seem to be, decent amounts of funds out there. So the last question that I wanted to cover is, what are we fundraising for? I think in a general sense, we would probably know what we're fundraising for, right? We want to be able to do more of what we're doing. And possibly we do even have a specific project in mind. But I think the one thing that I would always say to anyone who is wanting to fundraise is that the more concrete you can be in what you're fundraising for, the more successful you're likely to be. So this is what I think that most funders and donors want to see. So firstly, we're much more likely to see the value in giving to a cause when we know what it is that we're contributing to. So an example quite quickly. So if you compare being asked to donate to help support the Cambridgeshire Repair Cafe network, for instance, to being asked to help put a repair cafe on every high street. So the first one, I think is probably a good cause if we know anything about the Cambridgeshire Repair Cafe network. But in the second, it sets out a compelling vision for what it is that the network is wanting to achieve. It makes it much more concrete what the group is doing. The second thing that you really want to do is make sure that you have a plan. So this is maybe less important when you are kind of shaking your tin or, whatever it is you're doing when you're asking your kind of average donor, but this is going to be something that will be much more important when you are talking to funders. They'll want the details of what the activity is, how much it will cost. They will be looking to see that your plan is realistic and also that you have the skills in place to deliver it. But they'll also be looking that you have some way of kind of knowing that you've achieved what you've set out to achieve. So if any of you were in the session earlier with Sandy Chidley, these are the sorts of things that he was talking about. And then you want to be able to convey to people why it is it's important. So both your donors and your funders will want a clear sense of the importance of what you're doing, some evidence of the issue that you're trying to solve, and that you understand that issue and how that will be addressed in the plan that you've put together. So the need and any evidence that you have. I do have very briefly an example, just a case study actually of this was the Cambridgeshire Repair Cafe Network Green Match Fund campaign that we did a couple of years back. And this was what we put together. So we outlined the need, items are being thrown away, replacing them causes an increase in carbon emissions, which is bad for the climate. On top of this, people don't want to throw things away, but it's hard to make them last longer. So very clear, very concrete, and hopefully quite concisely a snapshot of what the picture is and some evidence. And then providing the solution. So we support new repair cafes around our region. Items are fixed, preventing them from going to landfill. And on top of that, the community benefits from increased connection and cohesion. So that's just a really kind of quick snapshot of sort of translating the idea of one particular project, hopefully into something quite concrete. I do have a bunch of resources here, which I won't go over too much, but they're places to go for more information on maybe getting constituted, fiscal hosting services, yeah, a whole bunch of different things that might help you get started with fundraising.